It's 4 a.m. on November 1st, 2002, and the affluent suburb of Brooklin in São Paulo. Brazil is wrapped in the pre-dawn silence that characterizes wealthy neighborhoods worldwide. Behind the imposing iron gates and exotic landscaping of a 3 million reais mansion, something horrific has just occurred that will shock Brazil and become one of the country's most notorious family murders. 19-year-old Suzane von Richthofen has just returned home with her younger brother Andreas after what she claims was an innocent night out. But as they enter their family's luxurious residence, they discover a scene of such brutal violence that their screams will wake the entire neighborhood. Their parents, Manfred and Maurícia von Richthofen, lie dead in their master bedroom, beaten, strangled and suffocated in an attack so savage that it defies comprehension. The crime scene suggests a burglary gone wrong, with money missing and papers scattered throughout the house. But keep this carefully staged crime scene in mind as we explore this story, because what initially appears to be a random home invasion will reveal itself as something far more sinister. A calculated murder plot orchestrated by someone the victims trusted completely, someone who stood to inherit millions from their deaths. The investigation that follows will expose not just a shocking betrayal of family bonds, but also a level of entitlement and narcissism that transformed a privileged teenager into a cold-blooded killer. To understand how a 19-year-old university student could orchestrate the murder of her own parents, we need to examine the world of extreme wealth that shaped Suzane von Richthofen's early life in São Paulo. Brazil in the early 2000s was a country of stark contrasts, where immense wealth existed alongside grinding poverty. São Paulo exemplified these contradictions, a megacity where over $200 billion flowed through the economy annually, while millions struggled in favelas just miles from luxury districts. The von Richthofen family occupied the pinnacle of this economic pyramid. Their suburban mansion in Brooklyn represented a lifestyle most Brazilians could only imagine. Multiple bedrooms, swimming pool, private library, and an office where Manfred conducted million-dollar business deals. Manfred Albert von Richthofen was a German-born engineer who had built a successful career as director of DERSA, managing highway infrastructure connecting São Paulo to the rest of Brazil. His wife Maurícia was a practicing psychiatrist serving São Paulo's affluent community. Think of the von Richthofen family structure like a perfectly engineered machine, where every component has its designated function. But machines can malfunction when individual components begin operating outside their designed parameters. When Suzane was born on November 3rd, 1983, she entered a world where every advantage was available from birth. 4 years later, her brother Andreas completed what appeared to be the ideal nuclear family. The von Richthofen children grew up with privileges unimaginable to most Brazilian families. They attended São Paulo's most exclusive private schools, with Suzane eventually mastering 3 languages fluently. Suzane appeared to be everything her parents hoped for: quiet, studious, and academically excellent. After graduating from a prestigious German high school, she enrolled in law school at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo. But behind this facade of achievement, Suzane was developing a toxic psychological relationship with wealth and privilege. Rather than understanding her advantages as opportunities for service, she began viewing them as entitlements deserved regardless of behavior. The family's wealth was estimated at approximately $17 million, with rumors of an additional 10 million euros in Swiss accounts opened in Suzane's name. This meant she would inherit enough money to live in luxury without ever working. In August 1999, what seemed like an innocent family outing to a model aircraft fair in Ibirapuera Park would set in motion the events that would ultimately lead to murder. Andreas, then 15, had developed an interest in model airplanes and was excited to learn more about the hobby. At the fair, Andreas struck up a conversation with 19-year-old Daniel Cravinhos, who had impressive skills in building and flying model aircraft. Andreas was immediately drawn to Daniel's expertise, and the von Richthofen parents agreed to hire him as a tutor to help develop their son's new interest. This arrangement brought Daniel into the family's inner circle, where he had access to their home, routines, and most importantly their daughter, Suzane. When Daniel began tutoring Andreas, Suzane was approaching her 16th birthday, an age where teenage rebellion often conflicts with parental authority. Daniel Cravinhos came from a completely different world than the von Richthofens. He lived in one of São Paulo's working-class neighborhoods, where economic opportunity was limited, and many young people struggled to complete their education. Both Daniel and his older brother Christian worked as mechanics in a local garage, having dropped out of school at relatively young ages. Where the von Richthofen children were taught discipline, delayed gratification, and the importance of education and professional achievement, Daniel had grown up in an environment where immediate pleasures often took precedence over long-term planning. The attraction between Suzane and Daniel was immediate and intense, representing everything that psychological research tells us about the appeal of forbidden relationships. For Suzane, Daniel offered excitement, rebellion, and escape from the structured world of privilege and expectation that defined her daily life. For Daniel, Suzane represented access to a lifestyle of wealth and luxury that had previously been completely beyond his reach. Think of their initial attraction like two chemical compounds that are stable when kept separate, but create explosive reactions when combined. The difference in their backgrounds and values created the kind of intense chemistry that overwhelms rational decision-making. Initially, Suzane kept her relationship with Daniel hidden, understanding her parents would disapprove of someone from such a different social background. This secrecy added excitement while establishing a pattern of deception that would escalate to murder. When the relationship came to light, Manfred and Mauricia's initial reaction was measured. They allowed Suzane to continue seeing Daniel while evaluating his character, hoping the relationship might be temporary. But as they learned more about Daniel's background, their concerns deepened. He had lied about being a law student, had no interest in education or career development, and spent most of his time using marijuana. Most troubling, he seemed to view Suzane primarily as a source of financial support rather than someone he genuinely cared about. The parents' attempts to limit the relationship only intensified Suzane's commitment to Daniel. Rather than recognizing their concerns as legitimate parental guidance, she interpreted their interference as evidence they didn't respect her autonomy. This dynamic is like a pressure cooker where increasing external pressure creates increasingly dangerous internal conditions. The conflict over Daniel reached a critical point during a month-long vacation that Manfred and Maurícia took to Europe, leaving both Suzane and Andreas alone in the family mansion. For 18-year-old Suzane, this represented an opportunity to demonstrate her maturity and responsibility to her parents. Instead, she used their absence to move Daniel into the house, where they spent an entire month living as a couple, using drugs, drinking alcohol, and treating the family home like their personal playground. When Manfred and Maurícia returned and discovered what had happened, the resulting confrontation shattered any remaining trust between parents and daughter. The arguments that followed were intense and sustained, with Suzane making increasingly unrealistic demands for financial support of her relationship with Daniel. When she asked her father to purchase an apartment where she and Daniel could live together, his response was both reasonable and devastating to her sense of entitlement. Manfred told Suzane that she was free to live however she chose, but that she would have to support herself and Daniel with her own money rather than expecting her parents to finance a lifestyle they couldn't approve of. He also threatened to cut off her allowance if she continued to defy their reasonable expectations about her behaviour and choice of companions. For someone who had never been denied anything she wanted, this confrontation with consequences represented a psychological crisis. Rather than accepting that her parents had legitimate concerns about her relationship and her behaviour, Suzane began to view them as enemies who were preventing her from accessing the wealth and independence she felt she deserved. This shift in thinking is like a computer virus that corrupts the operating system. Once the fundamental programming is damaged, every subsequent decision becomes distorted and potentially destructive. By late 2002, Suzane had moved beyond simple rebellion into active planning for her parents' elimination. The psychological process that enabled this transformation reveals the dangerous intersection of extreme entitlement, romantic obsession, and access to wealth. In Suzane's distorted thinking, her parents had become obstacles preventing her from accessing both the love she wanted with Daniel and the financial independence she felt she deserved. Rather than recognizing that their concerns about Daniel were based on legitimate observations about his character and intentions, she convinced herself that they were simply being controlling and unreasonable. Daniel and his brother Christian were facing their own financial pressures, as their work as mechanics provided barely enough income to support basic needs, let alone the lifestyle that Daniel had begun to envision through his relationship with Suzane. The prospect of inheriting millions of dollars through Suzane made murder seem like a business transaction, rather than the destruction of human lives. The planning process revealed the calculating nature of their conspiracy. They researched the family's routines, security systems, and schedules. They identified opportunities when the house would be vulnerable and developed strategies for creating alibis that would deflect suspicion from themselves. Suzane's role in the planning was crucial because she had intimate knowledge of her parents' habits, the house's security systems, and the family's financial arrangements. Without her inside information and active cooperation, the murder plot would have been impossible to execute successfully. This collaboration represents one of the most chilling aspects of the case. A daughter systematically gathering intelligence about her parents' vulnerabilities and sharing that information with people who intended to kill them. On October 31st, 2002, Halloween night, the murder plot was finally executed with a precision that revealed months of careful planning. The timing was deliberately chosen to coincide with Andreas attending a LAN party, ensuring that he would be away from the house when the violence occurred, but available to serve as Suzane's alibi. At 9 p.m, Suzane drove Andreas to his computer gaming event, maintaining the appearance of a caring sister looking out for her younger brother's social activities. After dropping him off, she returned home with Daniel and Christian, who had equipped themselves with crowbars, surgical gloves, and hoods to conceal their identities. The family's security guard spotted Suzane returning home but wasn't alarmed, as it was normal for family members to come and go at various hours. This detail illustrates how Suzane's insider status made the attack possible. External intruders would have immediately attracted attention and investigation. Once inside the house, Suzane checked to ensure that her parents were asleep in their bedroom before disabling the security system that would have alerted authorities to the break-in. She then positioned herself in the living room while Daniel and Christian went upstairs to commit the actual murders. The attack itself was savage and prolonged, revealing both the killer's inexperience with violence and their determination to ensure that both victims died. Manfred and Maurícia were beaten repeatedly with crowbars, but their struggles to survive forced the attackers to resort to strangulation and suffocation, using towels and plastic bags. The medical evidence later revealed that both victims suffered extensively before dying, suggesting that they may have been conscious during at least part of the attack. This detail adds another dimension of horror to the crime. Not only were they betrayed by their daughter, but they likely understood what was happening to them in their final moments. After completing the murders, the three conspirators spent additional time staging the crime scene to support their cover story of a burglary gone wrong. They scattered papers throughout Manfred's office in what they thought would look like frantic searching, removed money from various locations in the house, and created other evidence of theft. But their staging efforts revealed their inexperience with actual criminal investigation techniques. The damage was too neat and systematic to suggest panic-driven burglary. Important valuables like electronics were left untouched, and some rooms showed no signs of disturbance at all. Most critically, the security system had been disabled from the inside using the correct code, indicating that the intruders had intimate knowledge of the family's security arrangements. This detail alone should have immediately focused suspicion on family members or close associates. After completing their staging, the three conspirators separated to establish individual alibis. Christian went to a fast food restaurant where he made sure to be seen and remembered by staff. Daniel and Suzane spent the night at a motel where they explicitly requested a receipt that would provide evidence of their location during the time of the murders. At 3:30 a.m, Suzane picked up Andreas from his LAN party and drove him home, where they would discover the crime scene together. Her performance as a shocked and grieving daughter would be the final component of their elaborate deception. When Suzane and Andreas entered the house and found their parents' bodies, their reactions provided the first clues that something wasn't right. Andreas was genuinely traumatized, struggling to breathe and requiring medical attention for severe emotional distress. Suzane's reaction was notably different. While she appeared upset, her emotional responses seemed controlled rather than spontaneous. Her tears came and went in patterns suggesting performance rather than genuine grief, and she demonstrated remarkable composure for someone who had supposedly just discovered her parents brutally murdered. The siblings' statements to police also contained discrepancies. Suzane claimed her parents had supported her relationship with Daniel, which was obviously false. She also provided timeline details that didn't match Andreas's account. More troubling were reports that Suzane had hosted a pool party at the mansion just 3 days after the funeral, suggesting someone remarkably unaffected by her supposed trauma and loss. The case broke open when an anonymous tip reached police about a suspicious purchase made shortly after the murders. Daniel Cravinhos had walked into a motorcycle dealership and purchased a Suzuki GSX with cash, paying the entire amount using $100 bills. This purchase was immediately suspicious because everyone who knew the Cravinhos brothers understood that they were chronically broke and spent most of their income on drugs. This sudden appearance of thousands of dollars in cash, combined with the timing of the purchase, suggested a connection to the von Richthofen murders. When police brought Christian in for questioning, his tough guy facade crumbled almost immediately. Unlike his younger brother Daniel, Christian lacked the psychological sophistication to maintain a complex lie under pressure. Within hours, he had confessed not only to his own role in the murders, but also to the involvement of Daniel and Suzane. Christian's confession revealed the full scope of the conspiracy, including Suzane's role as the mastermind who had provided inside information about security systems, family routines, and the location of valuables in the house. His account made clear that the murders had been motivated by greed and the desire to access the von Richthofen family fortune. The arrests of Daniel and Suzane followed quickly, and faced with overwhelming evidence of their guilt, both eventually provided their own confessions. However, their accounts differed significantly in terms of motivation and responsibility, with each trying to minimize their own culpability while maximizing that of their co-conspirators. While awaiting trial, Suzane was released on bail, a decision that would prove to be a significant mistake for the prosecution's case. During this period of freedom, she attempted to manipulate public opinion through a carefully orchestrated media interview designed to portray her as an innocent victim, caught up in events beyond her control. During the televised interview, Suzane presented herself as a broken young woman who missed her parents desperately and had been manipulated by Daniel into participating in events she didn't fully understand. She cried on cue, spoke about her love for her family, and claimed that Daniel had destroyed everything she held dear. The performance might have been effective if not for a technical error that exposed its manufactured nature. A third-party camera accidentally recorded Suzane's lawyer, coaching her on when to cry and how to appear vulnerable and defenseless. The footage showed her taking direction like an actor, then immediately switching into the emotional performance when the official cameras started rolling. This behind-the-scenes footage was devastating to Suzane's credibility because it demonstrated her willingness to deceive not just investigators, but also the Brazilian public. Her tears were revealed to be fake, her expressions of grief were shown to be calculated, and her claims of innocence were exposed as elaborate lies. The exposure of this media manipulation eliminated any public sympathy that Suzane might have retained, and reinforced the prosecution's argument that she was a narcissistic sociopath capable of extraordinary deception and emotional manipulation. When the trial began on July 17, 2006, prosecutors presented evidence that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and the calculated nature of the murders. The testimony established a clear timeline showing how Suzane had systematically gathered information about her parents' vulnerabilities and shared that intelligence with their killers. The courtroom heard detailed testimony about the night of the murders, including forensic evidence that contradicted the defendants' claims about their respective roles in the violence. Physical evidence showed that both victims had suffered extensively, with multiple methods of attack used when the initial beating failed to kill them quickly. Prosecutors characterized Suzane as the mastermind behind the crime, arguing that her intimate knowledge of the family's routines and security systems had been essential to the success of the murder plot. They presented her as someone who had coldly calculated that killing her parents was preferable to waiting to inherit their wealth through natural means. The defense attempted to portray Suzane as a victim of manipulation by Daniel, claiming that drugs and psychological coercion had impaired her judgment and ability to resist his influence. They also alleged that her parents had been abusive, creating circumstances that justified desperate action. But these defense arguments collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence. Andreas testified about the loving relationship he had observed between his parents and sister. Autopsy results showed no alcohol in the victim's systems, contradicting claims of alcoholism, and Suzane's own behaviour after the murders suggested someone celebrating freedom rather than mourning loss. On July 22, 2006, after just 5 days of testimony, the jury found all 3 defendants guilty of murder. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against them and the calculating brutality of their crime. Suzane and Daniel were each sentenced to 40 years in prison, while Christian received 38 years as a co-conspirator. While prosecutors had sought 50-year sentences, the actual terms represented substantial punishment that would keep all 3 incarcerated for the majority of their adult lives. The sentences reflected both the premeditated nature of the crime and the aggravating circumstances of family betrayal and extreme violence against vulnerable victims. Brazilian law considers family murder to be among the most serious crimes possible, carrying penalties that recognise the fundamental violation of trust involved. However, the Brazilian prison system's approach to rehabilitation would prove to be surprisingly lenient toward the convicted killers, allowing privileges and freedoms that seemed inappropriate given the severity of their crimes. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is what happened after the convictions. Despite being sentenced to lengthy prison terms for brutal murder, Suzane has taken advantage of Brazil's semi-open prison regime, which allows convicted murderers to leave prison for holidays and vacations. Photographs have emerged of Suzane attending parties during these releases, suggesting someone who views imprisonment as minor inconvenience rather than appropriate punishment. Her apparent lack of remorse raises serious questions about allowing such privileges for family murderers. Even more galling is the fact that Suzane is likely to inherit her parents' wealth upon release, meaning she will ultimately profit from the murders she orchestrated. This represents a fundamental miscarriage of justice that rewards rather than punishes her crimes. Suzane has made multiple attempts to reduce her sentence, including claiming that personality disorders should be considered mitigating factors. These appeals reveal her continued belief that she deserves special treatment. The most tragic figure may be Daniel von Richthofen, who lost not only his beloved parents, but also his sister and childhood friend to the criminal justice system. As the sole surviving family member, he inherited the trauma of discovering his parents' bodies and knowing his sister orchestrated their murders. Andreas never recovered psychologically from these losses. In 2017, he was found wandering São Paulo's streets in a dissociative state, breaking into homes while carrying family heirlooms. His breakdown represented the final destruction of the von Richthofen family unit. The von Richthofen case became one of Brazil's most notorious family murders, capturing public attention because it challenged fundamental assumptions about family bonds, privilege, and social responsibility. The case was extensively covered in Brazilian media and spawned books, documentaries, and television programs examining the psychology of family murder. The case also highlighted disturbing aspects of Brazil's criminal justice system, particularly the way wealthy defendants can manipulate media coverage and legal proceedings to their advantage. Suzane's ability to present herself as a victim, despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt, demonstrated how privilege can be weaponized even after conviction. For Brazilian society, the case represented a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme entitlement and the way wealth can corrupt moral development when not balanced by appropriate values and accountability. Understanding how Suzane von Richthofen could orchestrate the murder of her loving parents requires examining the psychological development of extreme entitlement and narcissism. Her upbringing in privilege had created a worldview where her desires automatically took precedence over other people's rights, needs, or even lives. The progression from typical teenage rebellion to family murder involved several psychological steps. First, she developed the belief that her parents' concerns about Daniel were illegitimate attempts to control her rather than expressions of love and wisdom. Second, she began viewing their wealth as something she deserved immediately, rather than something to be inherited through natural means. Finally, she convinced herself that murder was justified because her parents were preventing her from accessing what she believed belonged to her. This psychological progression is like a moral compass that gradually loses its ability to point toward right and wrong. Each rationalization makes the next one easier, until behaviors that should be unthinkable become not just possible but seemingly reasonable. Suzane's continued lack of remorse and her attempts to profit from her parents' deaths suggest someone whose moral development was permanently stunted by privilege and entitlement. Even facing the consequences of her actions, she remains focused on her own desires rather than the lives she destroyed. The von Richthofen case represents multiple failures of justice that continue to compound the original crime. Suzane's ability to manipulate media coverage during her trial, her access to privileges during imprisonment, and her likely inheritance of her victim's wealth all demonstrate how the legal system can fail to provide appropriate accountability for the most serious crimes. The Brazilian prison system's approach to rehabilitation assumes that convicted murderers can be reformed and deserve opportunities to reintegrate into society. While this philosophy may be appropriate for some criminals, applying it to someone who orchestrated the brutal murder of their own parents for financial gain seems fundamentally misguided. The fact that Suzane will likely emerge from prison as a wealthy woman in her 60s represents the ultimate triumph of entitlement over justice. Rather than losing everything as a consequence of her crimes, she will gain access to the wealth she killed to obtain just 40 years later than originally planned. This outcome sends a disturbing message about the relationship between privilege, crime, and punishment in Brazilian society. It suggests that even the most heinous acts can be overcome through patience and legal manipulation, provided the perpetrator has sufficient resources and social connections. The case of Suzane von Richthofen raises fundamental questions about human nature and family relationships that extend far beyond Brazil's borders. How does extreme privilege interact with moral development? What prevents most people from acting on murderous impulses when frustrated? Why do some individuals develop the capacity for ultimate betrayal, while others in similar circumstances do not? These questions are particularly relevant in societies with extreme wealth inequality, where the gap between rich and poor creates psychological pressures that can lead to violence. The case demonstrates how wealth without wisdom, privilege without responsibility, and desire without discipline can create individuals capable of destroying everything they claim to value. The case also illustrates the importance of recognizing warning signs of dangerous entitlement before they escalate to violence. Suzane's progression from teenage rebellion to family murder involved multiple decision points where intervention might have been possible. Perhaps most importantly, the case serves as a reminder that evil can exist behind beautiful facades, and that people who seem to have everything may be most dangerous when they decide they want more. Manfred and Maurícia von Richthofen worked their entire lives to build wealth and opportunities for their children, only to be killed by the daughter they had loved unconditionally. Their story serves as a tragic reminder that privilege is a responsibility rather than just an advantage, and that parents cannot love their children into becoming good people if those children choose evil instead.